Hello, welcome to episode 5 of Followers of the Cross podcast. This is your host, Jason Reynolds. In each episode, I interview a Christian author, musician, or other creative person. Today I'm speaking with Ken Wytsma, a Christian who is creative in so many ways. Ken is the founder of the Justice Conference, a conference that helps Christians live out God's Word through social justice. He also is the president of Kilns College and the lead pastor at Antioch Curch in Oregon. Ken is the author of a new book, Create versus Copy. Moody Books is the publisher. In the book, Ken talks about the theology behind creativity. He discusses practical ways to fan the flames of creativity and not simply copy the latest leadership trends. And now to the program.
Anyway, thank you for joining us today, and your book is very interesting as someone who has a creative bent. If you don't mind, just talk a little bit about create versus copy and a little bit about the difference between those two concepts and also how they overlap.
Yeah, I'd be a bit of a creative myself, and I remember sitting down thinking one time that from a leadership standpoint, if you copy, you're never really at the front edge of leadership. So if someone else has blazed the trail and you're following behind, you're never really going to make the innovation or lead the change or whatever it might be, because somebody's already gone ahead. And so I started with this idea of create versus copy, kind of from a leadership standpoint, and I kind of began to realize that it really frames all of life if we kind of take it into account that certainly we borrow, certainly we copy, we look for best practices, we learn through rote memorization, whatever it might be. Templates are very helpful, very useful, but somehow life is best lived when we take that as building blocks and we seek to try and create our own story and write a narrative, and that we all have that creative ability within us to really live out from a creative mindset. So I kind of like to say, just as the Renaissance artists borrowed, classic antiquity in terms of art and sculpture, they borrowed from the writers that had come before, the Latin writers, and they took all of those things that were kind of finding a rebirth in Renaissance Italy, but they did it always with a mind of transforming. So they borrowed, they copied, they used, but always with a mind of creating something magnificent themselves, always with the mindset of transforming. And so create versus copy is just my attempt to kind of help people realize that they're made in the image of a creative God, and so they therefore are creative. So artistic ability may be a skill or a trait that some possess, but creative ability is a human trait that we all possess.
Yes, that was an interesting point you made in the book about how do we represent God in artwork, and do we necessarily go to, in the beginning, God created? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know that God is a creative God in the sense that he once made something, but I think that we feel like maybe he's been bored ever since, or sitting back, and so we don't really think of God as a creative or actively creating kind of being. And so in Isaiah we see some verses to the contrary where God really tries to tell people, hey, I'm the one that created the blacksmith who creates the weapons of war. So instead of being afraid of things that cause war or that scare you, threaten your life, look rather to me, because I'm over all of all that. I'm actively creative. I'm engaged in the world. I'm sovereign. And so we see that God did create. He created in the past. He creates now, and then he also is going to create in the future with all the promises of the new heaven and the new earth, and what that'll be like in terms of shalom and goodness and beauty. And so seeing God as someone who's actively, dynamically a creative being, and realizing we're made in his image, we bear a trace of that creativity, that when we really nurture or allow that to flourish in our lives, it's going to be remarkably different than when we just kind of close ourselves off and fall into kind of the routine.
And to me, that turns back to in Scripture where God says that we see Him in nature, in the cosmos, and all of that. Is that sort of like something?
Yeah, there's a knowledge component here, right? So theology is that fancy word about how do we know God, and you know an artist through the artist's creation. You know a painter better through their paintings. And so we see that argument in Psalm 19 that the heavens declare the glory of the Lord. Night after night they pour forth speech. So there's actually this kind of component where creation is teaching us about God. We know God better through it. And I think there's something about our own creativity as well, that if we're made in the image of God and that creativity is part of that image, the more we exercise that, the more we are being creative, the more we come to know who God is, the more we understand what it is to be fully human. So I think there's a knowledge component, even in our own creative acts, our own creative energy, in how we come to understand God.
Okay. And then later on in the book, you talk about the first step of innovation and hitting refresh. Go into that a little bit more, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I tried to, in the book, in Create Verse Copy, to lay out a theology that says we're created in the image of God. Creativity is something that goes on through time, like it does with God, and that ultimately, like God, our creative acts are aimed at making space for life. That the highest form of creativity is not just self-expression, but that I've actually created space for life to flourish. And then when you put that along, when you kind of flip it over and say what correlates with that theology in terms of a practical kind of focus on creativity, the first word is imagination. Just the fact that we are creative means we have imagination. We dream up things. We come up with new ideas. We have moments of inspiration. So imagination is the first part. The second part is just a discipline or a habit of creativity. So that whole idea of creativity through time is really about continuous creativity. And then lastly is innovation. So imagination, continuous creativity ultimately leads to innovation. And innovation is simply something that began first as an imaginative spark and has now found its way into the world in such a way that it works. It makes a difference. It's a part of making space for life, helping a church be able to perform its programs better, a nonprofit to make a greater difference in the lives of people, a for-profit business to be able to compete better and hopefully in some kind of a product offering that's beneficial to life. And so innovation is really the end of that chain or train of creativity as we find things that work in this world and make a change, leave a mark.
Okay. And if somebody feels like they're kind of in a rut, they're kind of just being worn out by life and not really able to do anything creative at a certain point of their life, what would you recommend to sort of get that spark going again?
Well, I think the first thing is when we're not being creative or we're stuck in, say, a job that robs us of our creativity, we first have to realize that creativity is part of what it means to be human. If we don't realize that, then we probably just won't care in the first place. But when we realize creativity is a part of our humanity, then we're going to care enough to maybe fight for it a little bit. We're going to say, wow, if that's a part of being fully human or flourishing, I need some of that in my life. So the first thing is just caring enough about it and seeing it as relevant to me. A lot of people say they don't have a creative bone in their body, and it's not true. They do. They're made in the image of God. They're creative persons. They might not be artistic. They might not be able to paint. They might not be able to sing. But they are made in the image of a creative God, right? So the first thing is just to care about our own human creativity, and then the second thing is to realize that creativity begets creativity, and so it's mainly just about getting going on it. And the more you think about it, the more you surround yourself with people, the more you do creative things, it only furthers itself. Creativity begets creativity. Ironically, fear kills creativity. So if we're trapped and we feel stressed, we're worried about the future, that can be a very debilitating place. On the opposite end of the spectrum from fear would be faith. It's that open-handed posture, that sense of what's possible, hopeful, believing that good things can come. And so if fear kills creativity, faith actually nurtures it. And so I think whoever that person is that wants creativity in their life but is stuck in a position that's very challenging, it's realizing, hey, as I try to walk by faith, as I pray about this, as I wrestle with this, it's going to be marked with moments of inspiration and imagination. It's going to bring about more creativity and hopefulness in my life that God is still acting. If He's still acting, I can still act, and that somewhere all of this is going somewhere good. And so, yeah, I just encourage them on regard to just getting started with creativity, encourage people with regard to faith, and try and name fear, because fear usually is the black hole of most everything.
Okay. When you talk about surrounding yourself with creatives, that makes me think of a church, one of the favorite churches that I've attended, which was in Nashville, and they just had such a huge number of parishioners who were so creative, whether it was music or art or writers, what have you. There was just, that church it seemed unique to me, because you did have so many people, and it was well known in Nashville for its music program. In a city of music, it was well known for its music. Tell me a little bit about your church. Do you have a pretty good creative vibe going there?
Yeah, we're known as a creative church, and certainly I hope that extends beyond just the artists. Oftentimes the artists, I like to say the artists are the pastors, the creative pastors to the rest of us. They help inspire, nurture, equip, train, so that we can all be more creative. So I really do think artists are kind of God's gift to the rest of us in terms of creativity. And so it's not just about the artists, but it's about inspiring people in the church to believe that they have something to contribute. And so we used to do something, and still do, but we do it periodically, called Art Sundays. And we have just everyone from the church bring things that they make or that they create, pictures that they take when they're doing photography. People that are great with floral arrangements make floral arrangements. People that are great with culinary art bake or make something really tasty. But it's this really interesting way to affirm at a large level that everybody has something to offer. That it's not just those that play a music instrument or have a pretty voice that are relevant to the church, but that all of us have these creative gifts and capacities that we can contribute in terms of the edification of that community. So yeah, I think it's creating an environment where artists feel like they're appreciated, but also creating an environment where the artists inspire others rather than just merely perform for them.
And I think a lot of times people tend to say church is one thing, that's where I go to do my faith thing for the week, and then they go to work. And for most people, they're working in a secular job, and sort of turn the faith off, or they just don't think that they can integrate it. But talk a little bit about creativity in the workplace, especially if you're working for a manager or a team that just, it's about the numbers, it's about the productivity. You got to get more of this work done, and now you have less resources to do it with.
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd just simply say is, in the Psalms, it talks always about singing a new song. And so I think there's a place we have to find where we're not operating out of formula or routine, but we really are operating out of faith, and a faith that believes we can declare something praiseworthy to God, that we can sing a new song. And I think that when we take down that secular sacred divide a little bit and realize that all of life is our canvas, so to speak, that there's